Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for introducing me, Julia. As I'm sure you all heard, my name is Ruby. I'm the Reference and Outreach Archivist here at YIVO. I hope you're all doing well. It's great to see some familiar names in the chat, and it's great to see so many new people as well. I'm so glad you could all make it here today. If you want to watch this back later, the recording of this talk will be posted online soon. Um, this talk is a part of our How to Do Research at YIVO series. The previous talks in the series are also available online, so I'm going to try not to reiterate too much of what has been covered earlier in the series, which does mean we'll be jumping in assuming some knowledge of using YIVO's online resources. Today we're going to be covering how to use YIVO finding aids. Finding aids are documents that contain information about individual archival collections. They can include collection level descriptions, descriptions of individual materials within a collection, historical information, and really any range of pertinent metadata. We're going to go over a few different types of finding aids we have in our collection so that you can better understand how they can help you in your research. And at the end, we'll have time for a few questions, so if anything comes up, don't hesitate to ask. What I will say also is I will likely today only be answering questions that are relevant to the topic at hand, being finding aids. If you have further questions about how to use our materials, anything that doesn't fit within the scope of finding aids, I recommend reaching out to me directly at reference@yivo.org. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about your own research. So I want to get into finding aids a little bit. And the first finding aid I'd like to show you, I'm going to share my screen. Um, I'd like to show you a sort of standard and very thorough finding aid. I am sharing my screen now. Can you all see that okay? I am assuming you can see that, and if not, I'm assuming that Julia will say something. Um, this is the Abraham Sutzkever Shmerka Kaczorginski Vilna Ghetto collection. This is part of our Vilna collections in general, meaning that it is completely digitized and that it comes from our original collections from Vilnius, Lithuania. And we'll see, this is the finding aid. We see that it has these two main components on, I'm realizing I'm putting my hand out, but you can't actually see what I'm gesturing at on my screen. We have the left side, which includes information about the collection and the specific materials that we are looking at in the collection. And then we have this right-hand menu, where we can navigate throughout the collection itself. I'm going to go through that a little bit more now. First, I want to start with this navigation menu. I can expand this menu. Actually, I'm sorry. Let me go back just a second. Um, if the layout of this page looks familiar to you and you haven't been using YIVO's collections in the past, that's likely because you've seen other finding aids built using a software called Archivespace. This is the software that we use to build our finding aids, and it's a very useful software, but it also means that there are some technical aspects of it that we do not have control of. For example, Archivespace is better to use on Google Chrome or on Firefox than on other browsers like Safari. If you run into any trouble using a different browser, I recommend switching to Chrome or Firefox for your use of Archivespace resources. Um, that said, it is a very useful and functional software for us. Um, and I'm sorry, let me just jump right back into what I was talking about with regards to collection organization. So when we're on this page here, this refers to one collection, an individual collection in our archives. The identifier for this collection is RG 223.1. RG stands for record group. So record group 223.1. This refers to a collection of items that are that pertain to related materials, where the materials are related to one another. Sorry, in any case, we can go into the collection organization here. We'll see with this collection that it's split into, I believe, 31 series. These series break up these materials onto a more granular level. So these are all materials from the Vilna Ghetto. But when you look at these individual series, we can see how they're split up by category. So we have maps and related documents, for example, diaries and chronicles, notices, orders, announcements, releases, ordinances, etc. So you can see when you're looking at this pretty clearly how these are split up. Often this will be described next to where it says series right here. There are, I believe, a few collections where it doesn't make it as clear, but generally you can figure out what the organization is by going into the series and looking at what the files are themselves. So you can look at the individual files by clicking on the arrow next to a series, and you'll see this drop down of all of the folders in that collection. Generally, these are folders. So generally you have the high level collection. Within that, you have series, and then within the series, you have folders. Not every collection has series. Most collections have folders. Um, Folders are generally the smallest unit that we will describe to in these collections. Um, Occasionally you'll find things on here that aren't folders, but are photographs or are objects that don't necessarily go inside a physical folder. When I am talking about folders here, I am not talking about computer folders. I am talking about physical folders. I am talking about specifically folders like these. So what we have here is this digital description of a very physical object, right? And we can get down to the folder level and we can see the information about the individual folders, which you'll get into momentarily. But first I want to talk about the information we have on this whole collection. So going back to this page and looking at the left side of the page where we see scope and content note, we see dates, we see historical note, we see extent. This is a lot of information. And often it can feel kind of intimidating when you're getting into a finding aid for the first time to figure out what all this information means, how this is going to be useful to your research. So I just want to go over this piece by piece and talk about what each of these things means, or mean. So what we have at the top is the scope and content note. If we click see more, what we see here is that we get a broad overview of what is contained within this collection. So we see that this part 1 of RG 223 relates to the Vilna Ghetto during the Nazi occupation. We see that it reflects primarily the activities of the Judenrat in the Vilna Ghetto, and the Jewish interaction with the German and Lithuanian authorities. We see daily life and living conditions in the ghetto, statistical department. It gets a little bit more granular when we talk about the individual series. This is pretty much a list of the series right here. It's telling us what kinds of information we can expect to find here. When we look to the scope and content note, we can also sort of get a sense of what materials we won't expect to find here. So if most of this pertains to the interaction with the Judenrat, the Jewish life in the Vilna Ghetto, if it's talking primarily about statistics at the Vilna Ghetto, the partisans, Nazi labor camps, all of this, we can say with some confidence that there's not going to be a lot of material from non-Jewish Lithuanians who were not involved at all in the Nazi Party or any of this, Jewish or non-Jewish civilians during the Nazi occupation. There are likely some materials that are of relevance to that, but this wouldn't be a comprehensive collection on that. It would be more of a comprehensive collection on the Vilna Ghetto. And of course, the idea of something being comprehensive is difficult when we're looking at something like this, something where so much material was produced and also so much material was lost. Comprehensive is probably not the right word to use here. So forgive my mistake in that case. Okay, so once we move on past the scope and content note, which again goes over in broad strokes what we can expect to find in this collection, we can look at the dates. And for dates, we'll see it says creation, 1939 to 1950. So this is a span of about 11 years. When you see a range of dates like this, it does not necessarily mean that we have materials from all of 1939, all of 1940, all of 1941, all of 1942. It's not necessarily this year by year description of what's in there. This is a broad ranging description of what years are represented in the collection. Um, Sometimes you will see date descriptions that are more specific. That's a bit easier to do on smaller collections. When you're working with a large collection like this, it can be kind of unwieldy. Um, so that's one note with regards to the dates. Um, if we move down into the historical note, what we'll see here is that this is where we can find context, historical context about, in this case, the Vilna Ghetto and the Nazi occupation of Lithuania, um, and the occupation of Vilna, and all of these, all of this historical background that pertains to this collection specifically. Um, Sorry, I just want to look at my notes here. Um, the historical note uh will often also include these references that we see at the bottom here. Um, these are sources that you can look into to find out more about the historical context. So as you'll see, what we have in the historical note is about a page or two of information about the Nazi occupation of Lithuania. But as you might imagine, this is a well-researched subject. There are many, many books on this subject. Um, there's a lot to be learned here that you're not going to be gleaning from the finding aid itself. The finding aid isn't meant to be a history book. But often these finding aids will reference what books they're getting their information from. And these books can be great places to start with your own research into the topic if it's not something that you're very familiar with. So that's one note there. The historical note will also occasionally provide some background on how the collection ended up at YIVO. In this case, we actually don't get that here, because that information is in a separate custodial history note, which we see here. Custodial referring to whose custody the collection is in. So this is from of mixed provenance, governmental and organizational bodies, and we see that it's related to Herman Crook, who is the head of the Vilna Ghetto Library, um, and that it was rescued. These materials were rescued from the Vilna Ghetto in the post-war period. They were collected in the Jewish Museum, and they were sent by Abraham Sutzkever and Shmerka Kaczerginski, who are the namesakes of this collection, to YIVO in New York after the war. So this is one way that you can find out a little bit more information about how the materials got to us. Not every collection will have that kind of information, but it's worth checking for. If it doesn't have that kind of that kind of information, it is likely that we do have that kind of information here, to some extent in what we call authority files. Authority files are the materials where we keep all of the information regarding like the donation of a collection, how we acquired a collection, some background information about it. These files are private, but if there's specific information you need from them, you can often ask us for it and I can try to get it to you. Again, the email for that would be reference@yivo.org. I want to move forward a bit to oh, this interesting list here, processing information. So we see list of changed file numbers in this finding aid. Folder 389 changed to folder 400. Folder 390 changed to folder 401. It gets really granular about what changes were made when this was being processed to put online. And when you're looking at that as a researcher, this may be of no use to you whatsoever. There's a good chance that it will be of no use to you whatsoever, because if you're doing your own research and you're looking through this collection, whatever folder it tells you that something is in, which I will show you how to find momentarily, will be the correct folder in the collection. Where this kind of information becomes useful is if you're following an old citation that refers to an old organization of the collection. So, if I have a citation for folder 390 and I go to what is currently folder 390 and do not find what I'm hoping to find, then if I go to this processing information and see that folder 390 has been changed to folder 401, I can track down the original information in its new location. I hope I'm not moving too quickly. Let me move forward a bit. I would like to talk about the creator and subjects and related materials. So here we have this list of related names and we have this list of subjects. These are used to tag individual collections so that they can be searched for more easily within our collections and so that they can be easily related to other collections. So we see subject and we see a list of 4 people, we see geographic, we see that it's in Vilnius, occupation, poets, topical, and then a list of topics. And what can be useful with these is that if you click through to any one of them, you can see a number of other collections that also use that that subject heading. I believe these follow the Library of Congress subject heading standard, if that means anything to you. And if it doesn't, it's very interesting and it's worth looking into, but I have nowhere near enough time to get into it here. And this way you'll see, because we are using these Library of Congress subject headings, that means that it's uniform among YIVO and among our partner institutions here at the Center for Jewish Research. So we're seeing American Jewish Historical Society records along with these YIVO materials. So that's worth noting because it's something that we can use to sort of unify these many collections. But don't let it trick you into thinking that these are all YIVO materials, is I guess what I'm hoping to get at here. Moving forward, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the folders in this collection. So we see here, we have our scope and content note, we see all of these things, and we have our menu on the right where we can navigate through the collection. If I navigate to this first file in the collection, let's see what happens. Okay. So the scope and content note, we'll notice that it's actually the same as the scope and content note that we saw for the whole collection, but this time it says from the collection on top. And that's literally what from the collection means. It just means that this scope and content note is not about this particular file. It is about the whole collection that it exists within. Sometimes you'll also see it say from the series, and that means that it refers to the whole series that it's in and not the individual item. You'll see this from the collection thing repeated in a few other places as well, in many finding aids that you look at, where we don't necessarily have folder level descriptions of everything, but we have a collection level description, and the collection level description is being applied to the folders. From the collection is what implies that it's not just about the one folder. And I see that people are speaking in the chat. I am not looking at the chat currently. If anything important comes up that I need to address midway through, I am hoping that Julia or August will let me know what it is. Okay. So we have this open and we're seeing this from the collection. We're seeing that the scope and content note is the same as the collection level scope and contents note. But you see that the dates here is changed from what we had before, which was, I believe, 1939 to 1950 to undated. So this particular document does not have a date. We see that this particular document is one folder. It is made with black pencil and red ink on soft red cardboard. We can tell from the title that it is a map of the Vilna Ghetto number 2. And then again, for the language of materials, these are the languages from the full collection. That does not mean that this map is in Yiddish and Hebrew and Russian and German and Polish and Lithuanian. It means that the language of this map has not been identified. Now we can also see this button that says View Online. We see this button because this collection has been digitized in full, meaning that you can view any of these materials in your browser. This is not true for all of our collections, so you will not always see this button. If you don't see the button, it means that it is something you will likely have to come view in person or request reference photos of, or you have a number of options here. But in short, if you're not able to view it online, but you want to see it, you can email me at reference@yivo.org. Okay, so if I want to view this online, I could just quite literally click view online. It'll take me to another tab. And in this tab, I will see the map of the Vilna Ghetto. I've already gone over viewing these materials a bit in I believe my previous talk that I gave in the series, so I won't get into this too much. But see, we have the plan for ghetto number 2 with the streets, and we see that this is, I believe, in Polish. So it's not, as I mentioned, it's not in Yiddish and Hebrew and Russian and German and Polish and Lithuanian. It's just in Polish, or maybe it's just in Lithuanian. So that's what we're talking about when I say from the collection. It's the collection level, but it's not talking about what's on the folder level. If it doesn't say from the collection, you can assume that it is talking about the folder level. We can see some specific details. We can see what the caption is, number here. Yep, and then we see the names of the main streets are in Polish. And then we see the physical storage information. So this is something that will be useful to you if you hope to see any of these materials in person, which, to be clear, with these materials that are digitized, we generally do not show those to people in person anymore. For the sake of their physical integrity, it's important that we have people view them online instead. However, using this as an example, if you were to want to see this in person, or if you were want to cite this, in addition to the title of the folder, you would want to know what box it's in and its folder number, as well as its RG number, its record group number. So this is record group 223.1, box OVR-01, folder 1. Usually these boxes will have just basic numbers attached to them. The OVR here refers to the box being oversized, just physically large. And that's something for us on our end, if we need to find this material, we know that we're looking for something that might be stored with other larger materials rather than in the same order as everything else. This is likely true with this next one as well. Nope, this one is box 1, folder 2. So that is not an oversized box. This is a normal sized box, and it is in folder 2 in that box. So you can take that information, box 1, folder 2. I will take a quick peek at the chat just to make sure. I am sorry if I'm moving too fast. But yes, if you have any questions for me, please post them in the Q&A, and I'll try to slow down a little bit so we can move through this at a more leisurely pace. All right. So now that we're on the second folder here, we notice that the scope and contents note has been replaced with a folder level one. Now that we're on a different folder, this folder has its own scope and contents note. Map of the Vilna Ghetto with a list of Vilna institutions. For the dates, we see that it is from 1942. We do not get an exact date. That's something that you'll find a lot. A lot of these materials will be able to discern what year it's from, but not necessarily down to the date itself. We see that the extent of this is one folder and that it is a reduced size negative photostat. I actually want to talk a little bit more about what extent is. When we see something that says one folder, that's pretty easy for us to understand. But if I go to the collection level again, and we see that the extent says 5 linear feet, that can be kind of confusing if you don't know what it's talking about. Like, what is a linear foot? How does the number of linear feet relate to how many documents there are, how much material there is? So extent really is a measurement of how much space the material physically takes up on our shelves. When we talk about 5 linear feet, which I'm not sure if that's actually accurate for this collection, but when you talk about 5 linear feet, we mean when we lie the boxes, when we put the boxes side to side on the shelves, it takes up 5 feet of shelf space. You'll find the materials in boxes like this often. These boxes are 5 inches wide, so this would be 5 5 inches or five linear inches, I guess. It is a legal sized box, but when we refer to it, we refer to it by the width of the box. So similarly, this is a 2.5 inch box. We would refer to this as 2.5 inches. It is also legal sized this way, but it is 2.5 inches. If you see an extent note that says something like 10 inches, you can generally assume that that is 2 5-inch boxes. If you see something that says a foot, maybe they're rounding up from like 2 5-inch boxes, but it could also be a banker's box. A banker's box is generally a foot wide. So that's where we get into this idea of linear feet, linear extent, that is talking about the physical space on the shelf. And that might not always be the most useful to you as a researcher, but it honestly can be fairly useful in some circumstances. If something doesn't have a very thorough finding aid, but you see that the extent is super short, that the entire collection is contained within a 2.5-inch box, you know that we don't have a ton of information, a ton of material in that collection, that it's pretty small, that you can likely get through it quickly if you're coming here to look at it in person. That I would say is probably the most useful aspect of linear feet for researchers, is understanding how much time you are going to have to spend to get through all of the material in a collection. Okay, so we've gone over extent. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the various tabs that we have on this page. So we have collection overview, collection organization, container inventory, and view digital material. What I will say is that 99% of the time, collection overview is what you're looking for. This is where you find the scope and content note. It's where you find the historical note. You have the collection organization set up on your right here. But I do want to go over these other tabs and what their utility can be. So if I go into collection organization here, you'll see that we have the scope and content note at the top. We have all of this top level information here, and then it's just broken up into these tabs of the different series, and we can see it item by item, along with the information about the individual items. This can be useful if you don't want to go through each one individually from the side panel here. But it displays ultimately the same information as going into one of these pages. So if I were to go into the Diary of Zelig Kalmanovich here, it would say the same thing on the collection overview page for the Diary of Zelig Kalmanovich, if that makes sense. If I go to the container inventory, this is again about how it is physically laid out in space. We're seeing at the top level what boxes things are in. And this can be useful too if you are following a citation where you know that something is in, say, box 8, folder, I don't know what folders are in box 8 off the top of my head. Say it's in box 8, folder 477. You can go to this container inventory page and go to box 8 and find folder 477 this way. This can be useful because we don't actually get the folder numbers in the side panel here. We only get the titles. So that can be one useful way to navigate throughout the collection. This fourth panel here is view digital material. It is just links to these digital to the digital materials for things. It just links to the view online button. Quite frankly, that tab is in and of itself not doing a lot of work. I find the other tabs to lead you to this much more quickly and painlessly. But I did just want to flag that that's an option. Maybe you'll find some wonderful use for this tab and you can tell me all about it if you do. I would truly love to hear it. Okay. So this is generally what a standard finding aid looks like. This finding aid is very, very thorough. It contains a lot of information, as you've seen. There's a lot here. It's in one of our like a very important collection of ours, a very historical collection of ours, which is why it's been described in such detail. This isn't to say that that collections that haven't been described in as much detail are of less importance, but rather that that is not what I'm trying to get across. My bad. Okay. So once we've gotten a sense of this, we might be getting an inkling that there are also other types of finding aids that we have not talked about yet. This is true. So I want to move on to the finding aid for a collection that has not been processed or arranged yet. This is technically the finding aid for the papers of Joel Slonim. But what you'll notice when looking through here is that it contains very little information as compared to the previous collection we looked at, which is chock full of information. So these are the papers of Joel Slonim. So we can find out a little bit from the title. These are likely papers that belonged to Joel Slonim. Oh, who was Joel Slonim? Here's the biographical and historical note. He was a Yiddish journalist, literary critic, and poet. The dates, unknown before processing. So this collection hasn't been processed, which means that no one has gone through, put things in folders, and looked at what dates are represented in each folder, what materials are represented in each folder as they're creating them. We know that it was created by Joel Slonim. And we see that this collection is unprocessed but available for use, and that if you have any questions, you can contact me, reference at yivo.org. We can find out a little bit more about the collection by, again, looking to the linear extent. That's 1 linear foot. But it also says extent before processing unknown. So what does that mean? How do we have this this number but also say that it's unknown? Well, what we mean by that, likely, if you see that something is 1 linear foot, but that the extent before processing unknown, is that we have it in a banker's box. The banker's box is probably not the final place for it. It likely does not fill up the entire box. And were we to move it into 5-inch boxes, it might not be 1 linear foot. It might be 5 inches. It might be 2.5 inches. It just currently is taking up the space of 1 linear foot, as it is being held temporarily in a banker's box. We see that the language of materials is Yiddish. This is useful. But as we're seeing here overall, this finding aid does not have a ton of information. Generally with a collection like this, if you want to find out more, you can contact me directly and I'd be happy to look through it for you. Sometimes we will stumble into unprocessed collections that are very large physically, and this can make them pretty unwieldy if they haven't been processed yet. And if you request more specific descriptions of those can be a little bit harder for me to get to you, just in terms of dealing with a massive amount of information. But we may be able to fast track it for processing if there is more interest, in which case you would be able to learn more about it. So we've gone over pretty much these papers that are unprocessed, and I want to talk about yet another kind of finding aid. We can't get enough of having millions of types of finding aids. So in RG 412, the Mordecai Moniak papers, we do see some of what we expected to see, of what we expect to see in one of our archive space finding aids. We see this little scope note. We see that we're looking at a range of composers and these manuscripts of liturgical music. We see the dates during which these materials were created. We see the creator, the biographical historical note. We see the extent, that it's 3 5-inch legal size boxes. When you see LGL, that means legal. So 3 5-inch legal means 3 of these. I realize I am talking about extent, but I think that it's something that doesn't necessarily come very easily to people. Because especially when you're not seeing these items on our shelves, when you're seeing individual boxes, you might not have a sense of what that extent actually looks like. And we can see that these materials are in English, Yiddish, and Russian. When we scroll down, we can find out a little bit about the arrangement of the collection. And then we see this thing here that says a digitized version of the legacy finding aid is available at, and then we have a link here. We are working to get these linked in archive space so that you don't have to copy and paste them into your browser. Right now, you do have to copy and paste most of them into your browser. So I can copy this and I can paste it into my browser here. And what we'll see is the legacy finding aid. So a legacy finding aid is a finding aid that we have on paper. Um, Paper finding aids prior to the advent of the internet were the only finding aids, really. Or prior to the advent of computers, I should say. Paper finding aids were the original finding aids. We're moving away from them because they're a bit harder to use. But there are lots of these collections where we have these perfectly good paper legacy finding aids that we just haven't converted into a digital format yet. Um, so what we have in these cases, in many of these cases, is we have them as PDFs, which you can look at in the same viewer as you would look at our digitized materials. And when you look through this finding aid here, you'll see that the information contained on it is pretty much exactly what we would expect to see in the archive space finding aid. So we have our table of contents. We see that we have an introduction, a scope and content note, series descriptions, a folder list, and then we have an index of composers. A lot of these paper finding aids have indexes, and these can be very useful for finding what you're looking for when you're not able to actually search the text of the material. So when I scroll down here, you can see that we have this introduction, we have all this information. This, I believe, was typed on a typewriter and then scanned in. As I'm sure many of you know, YIVO has been around since 1925, so a lot of our finding aids were really made just before computers in general, and certainly before any software that allows us to have things like this. So in these cases, the finding aids also become a part of our history, these paper finding aids. And you can look through here, you can look through the series description. We see a general sense of what's in each series. Liturgical music for cantor and choir is folders 1 through 11. That's the same information that we see here in, oh, I'm sorry, that is the wrong finding aid. The same information we see here in arrangement. And if we scroll through here, we get some abbreviations, and then we get a folder list. So box 1, folder 1, is a bound notebook of liturgical music for cantor and mixed voices and Yiddish songs. And for this, we even get the table of contents, which is really incredible. It's very specific. We don't usually get this specific in our descriptions. We see that folder 2 is another notebook. So maybe it's not a folder, maybe it's a notebook, but still, if you were to request this, you would say RG 488 is box 2, sorry, box 1, folder 2, or notebook 2. So this is where we'd be getting that information in this case. And then here, if we scroll to the end, we do get this index that can be useful if you know the name of the composer you're looking for and don't want to scroll through until you find their name on that list. So if you're looking for Gedalia Grossman, you can find Gedalia Grossman's music here. We have Atov Echartanu, you know, I don't need to read it all out. I imagine you're picking up what I'm putting down with regards to the index. It's a pretty classic index. Okay. So this is a legacy finding aid. And these can be useful to search. I will let you in on a little trick with these too. Often when these are typed up, if you download them with this button and you pull them into a software like Adobe Acrobat, you can run an OCR software on them and then search the text for what you're looking for that way. This isn't perfect, and it's not accurate enough to the point of us using it to make new finding aids, but it can be useful for researchers, I find, to be able to quickly search these these analog media formats. That said, this really only works when the finding aids are typed. Not all of our finding aids are typed. Some of them we get to see are very special handwritten legacy finding aids. And this is a really, I think, wonderful testament to YIVO's ongoing history. These were largely written up by volunteers. I'm going to copy and paste this legacy finding aid link into my browser. This is for the Abraham Manievich collection. He was an expressionist artist. We have his correspondence with famous individuals, including Einstein. Um, and so again, 2.5 linear feet, and we have this legacy finding aid here that I'm copying and pasting into my browser. And I am being conscious of the time, so I will get through this fairly quickly. This one, there is a small typo there, but you see here, this is a handwritten finding aid. This would not do well with an OCR service. For something like this, you're going to want to read through it. And this, you can tell, is really a labor of love. It is 94 pages of handwriting, all about what's in this collection. So when you're looking at something like this, you can take a look at it and go, okay, I think this is the box number, box 2, folder 22. This seems to me to be the page number within the finding aid. The letter written on, oh boy, I can't particularly read that. But in any case, we get these specific descriptions of what's in each folder, handwritten. What I will say also, one thing I do want to flag is that these handwritten, any of these legacy finding aids, one of our big volunteer projects is having people just transcribe what's on them so that we can make them into these updated finding aids. If that's something you're interested in doing, that's also something you can contact me about, reference at yivo.org. And that's something really wonderful that a lot of our volunteers can do. It's something you can do fully remotely, as most of these are available digitally. Okay, so I'm just going to fly through a couple more things. I want to talk about one more thing we might find in legacy finding aids, which is, it'll be a little secret, hold on. So this is RG114, which is our plays collection. If I go in here, you'll see that this finding aid is actually in Yiddish. This is one really fun quirk of YIVO's, I think. A lot of our finding aids are from when we were like a primarily Yiddish-speaking organization. And we'll see here that we have actually a combination of typed Yiddish and of handwritten Yiddish. This is a really wonderful finding aid. One thing you'll also notice here is that this finding aid is really short. It's only 3 pages and then a supplement of 1 page. And this might seem fine at first, but when we look at the collection itself, when we look at this other, when we look at it in archive space, we see that the extent is 15.5 linear feet. That's 31 5-inch boxes. And there is no way that much information is being summarized in a 3-page finding aid. And the case with materials like these, is that because these finding aids are on paper, we're not really able to update them the same way we are able to update something digitally. And so if more things are added, if we combine collections, we're not able to update them as regularly as we would be online. So you will occasionally find discrepancies that way between the legacy finding aid and the actual holdings of the collection. The truth of the matter with this RG114 is and as well as with a few other collections, is that the best way to search it is with a card catalog. So these card catalogs, I brought one to show you all because I love them dearly. These card catalogs are also handwritten cards, generally, sometimes typed, that you can come view on site or can ask us to search for you. If you've been on site and if you've come through to our reading room, you've probably passed these drawers and drawers of card catalogs. Maybe you've touched them and maybe you've gotten in trouble for that because these are ultimately archival materials that we ask people to view in our reading room rather than just in the hallway. But this is another way in which our information is organized. I also want to touch on like one more thing really quickly before we go to questions, or two more things rather. We do have a number of paper finding aids that aren't up online. For example, the Max Weinreich papers. This is a physical finding aid that we have here. Again, this is something that I could search for you if you're interested in that, or that you could come look at here in person. Um, One other thing I'd like to show you is that we have certain collections, such as our case file collections, like for HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, where what we have is these typed up indexes. And these indexes are often on paper. We have digitized this on our own end, but it's not available to the public. But this is again something where if you're not able to find the information online, it can help to just reach out to me at reference@yivo.org. Okay, I know I've just covered a lot pretty quickly. So I would love to take some questions now if it is a good time.
Yes, it is a great time. Ruby, do you want to unshare your screen and then we
I would
can
love to
share?
unshare my screen.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much, Ruby, for that wonderful presentation on finding aids. It always amazes me how much there is to learn about archival research. This is, I believe, our fourth program in this series, and there's much more to learn even after this program. So thank you so much. I want to just mention before we get to questions, I realized that we didn't talk much about YIVO's history, and Ruby did allude to YIVO's history throughout the presentation. So I just want to say a quick word about YIVO, which is that we are a very special place for the contemplation, celebration, exploration of Yiddish and Eastern European Jewish culture. And we are currently located in New York City. Ruby mentioned that we used to be located in Vilna. And our library and archive currently contains over 24 million documents, 400,000 books. So a lot of what Ruby was talking about is, or all of what Ruby was talking about is included in that 24 million documents, 400,000 books. So it's really, and these materials are used by researchers from all around the world. So it's really a wonderful resource for anyone, whether you're a
Great.
serious researcher, a scholar, or just someone who is curious.
And it also means that because we have these millions of documents, if you find a collection that doesn't have a finding aid, it doesn't mean that we're being lazy or that we don't care about that collection. It's because we have millions of not millions of collections, millions of documents that we are trying to describe. We are always working on finding aids. But as with every archive, there is always a backlog.
Yeah, so that actually brings me to my first question, which is a lot of these collections do have finding aids, a lot of them don't. If I wanted to research, like for example, you mentioned that the I believe it was RG, which one was it? It was RG 223.1, I believe, the Vilna Ghetto collection. That one, you mentioned that one has a very extensive finding aid. So what types of collections typically do have extensive finding aids and which types of collections typically don't? And again, that does not mean that these collections are any less important, but if I wanted to do research, what collection should I expect to have a finding aid?
Collections that we've had with us for longer generally are more likely to have thorough finding aids, just as a matter of time. There is also we also have extensive finding aids often for collections that see a lot of use, um, or for collections that we have digitized. That's something that we prioritize there. Collections that we don't often have, very thorough finding aids for are ones that are smaller or are newer. Um, that's generally how that goes. It also depends a little bit on what our volunteers want to work on, what people want to make finding aids for. Um, but yeah, I would say generally older collections and larger collections will have the most description attached to them.
Okay, great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then we have another question about someone who's interested in genealogy research, which we do find very often at YIVO. We have a lot of people interested in genealogy, especially people who come to these programs tend to be very interested in genealogy, which is wonderful. And so we have someone in the chat wondering, there's a couple examples of the type of genealogy researchers who might use the finding aids. Wait, sorry, I'm trying to read this question and trying to make it into a question form. Give me 1 second to just read it again.
All good.
So how would a genealogist use the finding aids? Like what types of finding aids and collections would you tend to veer genealogists towards?
So ultimately that really depends on what you're hoping to find, what kind of materials you're looking for, and where you're hoping these materials will be from, what time period, all of that. There are a number of resources that we have that are really great for genealogy. And I will show you one finding aid that I know a lot of people have found to be useful. I'll show you two things really quickly. I'm sorry, is this okay? Do we have time for this?
Go for it.
Okay. Um, and I can put the links to these in the chat as well. So this first thing that I want to show you isn't technically a finding aid, but it is organized like one. It is technically a resource because it's not specific to any one collection. It is rather a conglomeration of many different collections. So I will share my screen here. This is our Landsmannschaften collection or Landsmannschaften resource. Landsmannschaften are and were groups of Jewish immigrants from the same town in Eastern Europe, generally, sometimes from the same family. And this collection, you'll see that it's organized by location, by the location that these immigrants would have been from. So if we go to Austria, we can click through and see some Austrian specific ones. If we click through to Congregation Beth Aaron, Beth Shalom, we can see that there's information there in RG 123, folder 442. So that's just a single folder of information. And so then you can know that there's probably not a ton there. But that's something. It's better than nothing. It's a little bit. I often say to people that if there's a single folder of information, it's unlikely that it's going to have um a lot of information about their great-great-grandparent or anything like that. Just based off of size. Generally, if it's this much material, it's more organizational material, maybe a cemetery map. But you do ultimately have to see it or ask me to take a look at it to get that kind of information. But you'll see here it's the finding aid format that can be very useful. So this Landsmannschaft has its own whole RG, and if we were to look for that, we could pull up the resource for that collection as well, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if I'm explaining myself very well. So that is one way that this could be useful for genealogy research. Again, this isn't technically a finding aid, it's a resource because it points you towards a whole bunch of different finding aids, is really what it's doing. But that's a great genealogy resource. And another resource that people like to use for genealogy sometimes, again, would be for like a very specific case. Oh, and I didn't mean to put 10, I meant to put 12. Are the records of the Minsk Jewish Community Council. The reason why this interests people is that we have the birth registries from Minsk from 1879 to 1900, the Jewish birth registries. And so this is something that you would access through the finding aid, and the finding aid could help you find this. And we know that it's digitized. We can access it online here. Yeah, does that answer your question? I hope this is
Yeah,
pertinent to what you were hoping to find.
wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. All right, I think we will end with two questions that are somewhat related. So
Sure.
we have a question in the chat about like how to best search within a finding aid? And is it possible to search like delineating beginning and end dates? Is what is the best way to search within a finding aid? And also sort of related to that, is also, so you mentioned that there's these handwritten legacy finding aids that cannot be searchable with OCR because they're handwritten. Is there a, obviously there's a huge backlog, as you mentioned, because we have so many collections. But are there efforts to have the handwritten legacy finding aids put into a more searchable form?
Yes, so there is that effort that's happening right now with a lot of great volunteer work, transcribing those finding aids. If that's something that any of you are interested in doing, you can email reference@yivo.org, and I can put you in touch with someone who can make that happen. I also would like to, yes, I thank you for bringing up the point about searching within a collection. I will show you how to do that. Let me share my screen again. I'm sorry, I keep on accidentally opening up an app other than Zoom when I go to do this. Okay. So, see here, we're back in RG12, and at the top of this panel, we see something that says search collection and from year to year. So here, if I wanted to search for like birth records, and then I wanted to say from like 1900 to 1902 or something. Oh, and I would have to spell it right. I would have to spell it right. And then I could click search and nothing comes up because that's not what these are titled. These are titled birth registry. Okay, bad example. If I searched birth registry, and I said from 1900 to 1902 and I clicked search and still nothing comes up. Okay, bad example again. Because these all end in 1900. Okay, so we have to think about the start and end point. So if I searched birth and I went from 1800 to 1950 and I hit search, I don't know what's going on here. This is a terrible example. Usually this is much better. Okay, if I went into the Vilna Ghetto collection and I searched for map, I would get 10 results here. And so this one is from 1941 to 1942. This one's undated. This one's from 1942. If I'm only interested in 1942, I can filter these results and say from 1942 to 1942. And this should show me the one map from 1942. Does that make sense? I hope so. Okay.
Yeah, it's great. And any questions, any lingering questions that people have, please email reference@yivo.org. Ruby answers that email, and is very happy to help. All right,
Yes.
so let's perhaps end with two related questions that are not about finding aids, but just about the archives in general, because there
Sure.
are questions that we get very, very often. So one, if you have materials to donate, would you send those to YIVO? How should someone go about that? And two, what are the volunteer options? Because you did mention that we have volunteers in our archives. So what type of work do the volunteers do?
Okay, so to answer your first question, which is about donating materials, to donate materials, you can reach out to me at reference@yivo.org, or you can reach out directly to our accessioning archivist, Leo Greenbaum, lgreenbaum@yivo.org. We are not able to accept all donations. That's mostly for spatial reasons. If you think about it, we are in New York City and space runs out really quickly. So we do have to prioritize certain things over others, and it's not saying anything less about you or what you're hoping to donate if we're not able to accept it. And as for your second question, which was, please remind me.
About volunteering.
About volunteering. Yes. So currently what we have volunteers doing is writing finding aids for different collections. You could be the person who makes the thing that we spent this past hour looking at. We also have volunteers typing up descriptions of those legacy finding aids that we looked at, both the English ones and the Yiddish ones. Really, there's room for people in a variety of capacities. I don't believe we are currently taking on more in-person volunteers. If volunteering is something you're interested in doing, you can you can email me at reference@yivo.org or reach out to my colleague Halal Yadin at hyadin@yivo.org. And I will get you in touch, and everything will be wonderful. You'll get exactly what you need and you'll help us, and it'll be fantastic.
All right. Well, that brings us to, I think, the end of our program. Thank you so much, Ruby, for answering all the questions and for telling us so much about finding aids today. I learned more about finding aids than I would ever think ever would. So I'm going again, I'm
More
going
than
to
you could possibly want to know about finding aids.
more than I could ever possibly want to know, and more than I could ever imagine I would know. So I'm going to just put one last time in the chat, reference@yivo.org. That is the email to contact Ruby with any reference questions. And thank you so much. And this will be available on YouTube after the program, so you can rewatch it. And thank you, Ruby, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.